We have a great show lined up for you here today. We're going to be continuing our discussion about the tradition of Freemasonry from an esoteric perspective. This is not going to be about lodge Freemasonry. It is going to be about the deep underlying tradition, the deep underlying mystery tradition of Freemasonry, and the decoding of some of its symbols and allegories as to what they truly represent and what the original, unadulterated teachings of this tradition are attempting to convey. Again, I thought I made this abundantly clear, almost to the point of boredom last week, that what I was attempting to explain here is not what necessarily may be going on in the lodge system of Freemasonry, but instead that I would be explaining the esoteric underlying tradition of this tradition. Okay? The esoteric underlying teachings of this tradition. So with that having been said, let's go into our continued exploration of some of the symbols, meanings, and allegories that are contained within the Freemasonic tradition. We looked at the structure. We started looking at one of its symbols, and this is the most well-known symbol of the tradition. The compass is in the square with the G in the middle of it. I put a couple of stylized renderings of this up on the site. This is image number 2 and 3 if you were at the image section for tonight's show. And you see the square at the bottom on its point, and that's important in that configuration, what that represents, versus in the inverted form, which we'll get to. Okay? The square, as we talked about last week, represents lower consciousness. It represents base consciousness instinct. It would be the equivalent of the R complex of the brain, okay, in physiological terms. Okay, because ultimately what Freemasonry is all ultimately about is how to build a better brain. It's how to build a better person through building a better brain and heart within the person. Okay? That's ultimately what the craft is constructing. That's why it's called a craft. Okay, it's making something. And the concept or the principle of making is contained deeply within this tradition, as we're going to see tonight. So the lower aspects of the self need to be ruled by the higher aspects of the self. The lower aspects are physical, worldly identification. Okay, they need to be overcome. The base passions of the person need to be ruled over if the person is going to obtain self-mastery. That's what this tradition is ultimately about. Self-mastery. Becoming a being that exists in unity consciousness. As you think, so you feel, so you act. And therefore, the number 3 comes up over and over again in this tradition, because it is about these 3 aspects of consciousness: thought, emotion, and action. Okay? So, if we are going to square our actions, meaning put them into harmony with natural law, okay? Basically rule our actions, that they're not going to be controlled by other people, okay? We're going to make them upright. We're going to make them in harmony with morality, which we talked about in the natural law presentation. If you want to listen to that, go back to podcast number 36. I think people would get a lot from that. I eventually want to record that as a video and get it out there. But the square representing the base instincts needs to be made into something that is more perfected. Okay? It needs to be made into harmony with natural law and the divine aspects of the self, which are embodied in the shape of the circle. The square being the imperfect shape, okay? And the circle being the divine shape. Okay, so we need to circle the square. In other words, the shape that draws the circle is the compasses, the tool, I should say. All right? This is about geometers' tools. All right? And we talked about the G in the middle representing geometry last week. That's kind of where we left off. What does this G mean? That's where we're going to pick up tonight. All right? So the compasses represent flexibility, not rigidness, right? They represent ruling the passions, okay, the base instincts. They represent compassion, coming together in feeling, okay? Understanding we are one, understanding that we all have the same fundamental needs, desires, hopes, dreams, etc., and we're all in this situation together. And that compassion needs to rule over the base instincts of the being. Okay? So it draws the circle or the divine shape, and you see it depicted here over the square. Not just above it, vertically, but actually on it. If you look at it as laying these things down, like let's say on a table or something, that the compasses are on top of the square. That's important. They're not under it. The square's not on top of the compasses. It's the other way around. The compasses lay atop the square, okay? Because they are saying, it's symbolically saying this aspect is superior to and needs to basically be put first over the base instincts. Otherwise, we're going to have chaos, which is what we have now, okay? The way to get from the compasses, from the square, I should say, to the compasses is through the G, through the center, through the middle way, the middle path, as we talked about in the Kabbalistic tradition, and we're going to see repeated in the Masonic tradition. There's this concept of the middle path. In Kabbalah, we saw it as the middle pillar, okay? The pillar of, or the path, the middle path of mildness, which is the middle of the Kabbalistic tree of life, the Sephirotic tree, which we broke down. In Freemasonry, it's the middle pillar, also called Jacob's ladder, or the pillar of wisdom. Okay? So we'll look at that when we break down the first degree tracing board, hopefully later tonight. So these two stylized renderings that I put here with the G in the middle, you can then see repeated with the compasses and the square on image number 4, having the sun in the middle of it, okay? Because this G represents the light as well, okay? Light is a big symbol in Freemasonry, as is the sun, okay? This sun, again, is higher consciousness. It is the Christ consciousness. It is the solar mind, as it has been called, okay? It is higher level awareness of self, understanding of the true self, awakening, enlightenment, all of these things, okay? Concepts we've explored at length on this show, all right? Now, the G itself, I gave a general list last week, and let's take them one at a time again. The G in the middle of the compasses and square represents this third aspect of consciousness, which is ultimately our emotions, okay? If we're going to square our actions into harmony with higher consciousness, which is represented by the compasses. This is higher thought, the higher mind, okay? The compasses are compassion, right? Unity consciousness, the left and right brain coming together at the fulcrum point, the place of balance, okay? It's flexibility and it's harmony, all right? Drawing the circle around the square, the base instincts, all right? The G is the way to that state of higher consciousness, and it's the emotional aspects of self. The inner aspects, see, it's inside. The G is inside. It's not on the outside of the shape. It's inside of it. Looking within. Self-exploration. Understanding the true nature of oneself. Knowing oneself. Gnosis. The G is the first letter of the word gnosis in Greek. In Greek it's gamma, right? Gamma, nu, omega, sigma, iota, sigma is how you spell gnosis in Greek. In English, that transliterates to Gnosis, gnosis, knowledge, obtained from direct experience, from going within. Okay? It's another thing this G represents. It represents geometry, the allegory of geometric tools, geometers tools, being used to create. This is what we create with, our thoughts, our emotions, and our actions. The three aspects of consciousness. Okay? It also stands for the great architect of the universe, G-A-O-T-U, which you'll see it written as sometimes. Okay? This is God or the goddess. Okay? The creator. Doesn't make a difference what you view it as. All right? The creative aspects of everything that underlies everything that we see, that underlies the unity of all. All right? Gnosis, knowledge, goodness, everything that we want to create that ultimately serves us is done through getting in touch with that emotional center. All right? The G, right? I've said this can also represent Gaia, the spirit of the earth plane. All right? The spirit of this school that we are all ultimately in. Okay? And this place for experience and creation. It can also represent green. Green is the balanced color in the middle. Again, the G is in the middle. In the middle of the visible spectrum, we find the frequency green. It's the color that represents balance, nature, getting into harmony with nature. Green is found abundantly in nature, the most abundant color in nature. It's the love energy color. It's the color ascribed to the heart chakra. Okay? The Anahata chakra, as we looked at when we looked at Kabbalah and the chakra system. So green is another word that the G could represent. The gift of life, the gift of compassion, the gift of intelligence, the gift of emotions. Okay? The capacities that we can experience these things in while being human are gifts. It's the gift of the human brain. The three aspects of the human brain correspond to these three symbols in conjunction with each other. Okay? The square, right? The R complex. The G, the midbrain. The mammalian aspect of the brain, the emotional brain. Okay? And then the compasses, left and right brain hemisphere. The neocortex, the telencephalon of the brain. Okay? This three-fold pattern is repeated because it's all about consciousness and the self. That's what this is all about. People who want to continue to think all these traditions are about something external, go right ahead. Believe what you want and keep being deceived. These are all about the self and the tradition of understanding that we are all one, that we are all in the same situation together, and that we are all aspects of the divine. And to recognize that divinity in all others. Period. But, people will insist that's not what it's about just because sick, twisted, psychopathic people have perverted these teachings over time. So there is no original teachings. It's all one thing. And, that's what I believe, and I'm sticking to my guns no matter what the evidence to the contrary points to. Good luck with that. For those of us who really want to understand something deeper, let's continue. More about the G, okay? So I also stated it could represent the gate to higher consciousness. Okay? Higher consciousness is often depicted symbolically as a gateway or portal, a stargate. Okay? The gate to the gods, the gate to heaven, the gate to higher consciousness. All right? So gate could be another interpretation. All right? What I said at the end of last week's show, and what we're going to explore for a little while tonight, is what this G, the highest meaning of it, in all of my studies at least, that I've come to learn about what this G represents, is known as the generative principle. Now, the generative principle is essentially everything I've been trying to teach since the beginning of coming forward into the public. Everything I've tried to teach through my video series, my presentations, my podcasts, all of it. The understanding of the generative principle is really the only thing that can save humanity. If we don't understand how we create what we get, good night. And you could tack that on to what the G represents, okay? joking, of course, but my point here is the generative principle is about causality. Okay, the causal relationships regarding what we experience in what we call life in this three-dimensional space-time continuum. The underlying causal factors, which I said on day one of doing this show, which by the way, this is the 1-year anniversary of What on Earth is Happening Tonight. I've been doing this for exactly a year. It started on March 30th, 2010. Today's the 29th. This is the 1-year anniversary show. So, the generative principle. What we get is a result of causal factors that get set into motion. And if we don't understand those causal factors, or in other words, how we indeed created the manifestation called what we got, if we don't understand how we did that, we're going to continue to create things unconsciously that we don't want. The goal here is to learn what creates certain things and what creates other things, and then to choose wisely between those creative forces. And as we said before and looked at in depth, ultimately the only two things that really create or generate is love and fear. These are the underlying creative forces that go to work into making the experience that we all collectively share, called reality or the truth. Okay? So we need to understand how those two polarities work and how our choices between those two basic polarities ultimately affect everything that comes into manifestation in this reality. That is the generative principle, and it is the underlying hermetic principle that underlies all of the other hermetic principles that we looked at. We looked at those in the presentation about natural law. Okay? The 7 hermetic principles. The generative principle is the one overarching, unifying principle that underlies and unites all of those other 7 principles. And if we look at the number 8, it is an infinity symbol, which means ultimately this is how it always has been, is now, and always will be. It's infinite. It's eternal. It's forever. The generative principle is forever. It always has existed, exists now, always will exist, and everything in creation is bound by it. The end. And get over it. The generative principle. True care. That's what this G ultimately represents. The Genesis principle. The Genesis principle. How we create what we get. And so few of us understand that. That's the reason that the world is in the sorry condition that it's in. Okay, so that's the generative principle, or the creation principle, or the care principle. Okay? So, let's move on to an allegory of Freemasonry. All right, so we looked at the compasses and square and the light and the G, all right? We'll go back to the sun as a symbol of Freemasonry. This is depicted in image 4 and 5. As I said, that's what the higher aspects of consciousness are symbolized by the sun, okay, the light, shedding light on knowledge. I want to talk briefly about the word Mason, all right? So let's look at image number 6, which has a whole lot to it, all right? Image number 6, there's so much symbolism in it, it's a very complex image, okay, to break down in its fullness. But let's start with that. The word Mason, okay, means builder. And that's all it means. It means builder. If you're a Mason, you're a builder. And what I've said in my work is that everyone is a Mason, whether they, identify with the occultic or esoteric aspects of Freemasonry or not. It matters not. Everyone on this planet is a builder of our collective experience through what they think, what they feel, and what they do. The three aspects of consciousness that are used to create what we get here. Therefore, everyone is a Mason. Everyone is a builder. And that will be unpopular, saying that everyone is a Mason. I didn't say everyone is a lodge Freemason. I said everyone is a builder of their experience. Understand the difference. Therefore, we are all ultimately Masons or builders of what we get. Okay? That's what this word ultimately means. Now, here above this, in this image, you see, to all free and accepted. Okay? This is the distinguishment between two general types of Freemasons. Okay? There's something called operative Masonry. Operative Masonry, it stems from the builder guilds of the ancient world. Okay? And going back into the Middle Ages and the building of the cathedrals, and we can get into all of those origins, okay? And, perhaps we will. But essentially, some of the lodge aspects of Freemasonry come down to us in the modern world from some of these building guilds from the ancient past. And it goes right back into the times of, the building of all of the ancient sites, like the pyramids and the ancient temples, all of the wonders of the world, and ancient stone building techniques that have been lost to modern history. Okay? They go right into the dawn of antiquity and the dawn of mankind. All right? But more in the modern world, the lodge system takes some of its rituals and some of its symbols from the builders' guilds around the time of the 1st century AD into and upward into including the Middle Ages and the times of the buildings of the great Gothic cathedrals. These builders' guilds contained masons or very skillful stoneworkers that had the teachings, held the teachings of how some of these construction techniques were used to build these incredible monuments, okay? And they often would unite with each other because their craft, their art form, was very valuable to people. Kings and emperors and the church would very much seek out these building techniques when they wanted a huge structure completed or built, okay? And therefore it was a lucrative business. And you had side benefits. Even though there were despotic rulers in areas all over the world that would control through violence the movement of their people, what they were allowed to have, what they were allowed to do, what they were allowed to say, what they were allowed to read or even think, okay? These masons or builders were granted a modicum of freedom, okay? A level of freedom that wasn't afforded to other people so that they could move around on the earth in ways that other people couldn't. They were allowed to travel to certain places without their movement being restricted. They were allowed to have certain educational materials that were off access to other people because of these psychopathic rulers. Okay? So, not only that, but again, since their skills were in such demand, they were well paid. So they became knowledgeable, they gained knowledge of other cultures and areas of the world, and they became wealthy. And this is the origins of the lodge system, again, which I don't want to focus on very much, but just to give a brief background of, and you can read that extensively through any, Google search or checking out some books on Freemasonry itself. So this form that represents free, okay, is operative Freemasonry, or a true Mason, a true builder, or what could be said is an esoteric Mason. Okay, somebody that truly has the keys of the craft or of this esoteric tradition in their hands, in their minds, and in their hearts. That's a true Freemason. An accepted Mason is known as a speculative Mason. Okay? And this term was used for people outside of the craft that were taken into its knowledge, that were showing that they indeed wanted the knowledge that was held by the original esoteric teachings of Freemasonry. And again, as I said, this goes back to ancient Egypt and even before. All right? So much of the Masonic tradition has Egyptian symbolism within it. All right? Because the land known as Kem, which is where the Cometian mysteries came out of, this was an initiatory mystery tradition that came out of this region of the world and eventually became Freemasonry. It's one of its forms. Kabbalah is another one of its forms. And again, it's basically the same teachings. All right? And we'll see it shares some of its same symbolism. So, accepted Masonry is also known as speculative Masonry. Okay? People who are originally outside of this tradition of teachings that are accepted into them. All right? And you have operative and speculative forms of Masonry. The speculative form, however, ultimately deals with the allegorical aspects and the symbolic aspects. So we're not to say that this is a lesser form of Freemasonry. It's just the words free and accepted. Free alludes to the original operative Masons who basically became rich, powerful, etc. Okay, in the past, created the modern lodge system and then took other people into it from outside of it, or accepted Masons. But speculative Masonry is ultimately what we're teaching here. Okay, the word operative means you have to put it into operation in the world. It has to become integrated with your behavior, with your actions. Okay, so both of these forms of Freemasonry are important. I'm just trying to get you to understand what these words refer to on this image. So that's to all free and accepted Masons, okay? We see the compasses in square with the G. We've already looked at that, okay? And then we have the two pillars, okay, with the third symbolic form of the pillar being represented by this gentleman in the middle riding on a goat, okay, who we'll get to in a moment. Actually, we'll probably get to that in the second hour of the show when we hook up with Oracle Broadcasting. But we have these two pillars, okay? One is called the terrestrial pillar, and one is called the celestial pillar, okay? So we have these depicted, and we have the symbols of the sun and the moon above them, and the all-seeing eye. And we saw that previously when we looked into the religious traditions, into the solar cult, the lunar cult, and then the cult of the stars and planets represented by the all-seeing eye. And we're going to see this again when we look at the first degree tracing board. Okay? So, again, these pillars represent different aspects of consciousness, the actions and the emotions. The solar pillar is the actions, the lunar pillar is the emotional qualities. They need to be brought into synthesis with each other, or unity, such that we are doing that which we think and feel is right. And those things are not in opposition with each other. The middle pillar is represented by this gentleman in the middle there, blindfolded, dressed in white, riding on a goat. His name, Hiram Abiff. Hiram Abiff, A-B-I-F-F. Hiram Abiff is allegorically, okay, the prototypical Freemason. Okay, he is the builder of the Temple of Solomon. One of the three builders, I should say. Okay, as we saw before, briefly, the Temple of Solomon represents the self. It represents the three aspects of consciousness. It represents thought, emotion, and action, and it represents the body, mind, spirit connection. It also represents the brain, okay, the lower aspects of the brain represented by the checkerboard floor, the R complex, base consciousness, okay, which we see here in this image as well. Then we have the emotional aspects of the brain, okay, again, care, the G, the generative principle, true care. And then the higher aspects represented by the gods above, higher level thought, higher consciousness, non-earthbound awareness, or non-physical matter identified awareness. Hiram Abiff, okay, is another, it's a word play. It's a symbol and a word play. We're not talking about an actual person. This is an allegory. And I'm going to read a little bit about the allegory of Hiram Abiff coming up in the second hour. Hiram Abiff, it's a word play for high ram above. Okay? The ram, the symbol of Aries, the beginning of the zodiac. Okay? The ram has symbolic meanings in occultism. We saw it's used symbolically very often. Okay? Ram, of course, being a male sheep. Okay? It's a symbol of courage. All right? It's actually taking action in the world. All right? It's a symbol of force or power. All right? A symbol of divinity. And we'll get into that soon. Hiram Abiff is a symbolic representation of truth. The three builders of Solomon's temple of Hiram, king of Tyre, representing the R complex of the brain. Hiram Abiff representing the midbrain, who was ultimately building the temple for Solomon, the higher mind. The coming together of the neocortex, sun and moon, soul and moon, soul and moon. Okay? Hiram Abiff is the sacred feminine aspects of the consciousness, the emotions, alignment with truth, the Holy Spirit, the divine mother, so to speak. Okay? Even though he's a male figure, that's what he symbolically represents in this tradition. Okay? I'm going to read a little bit about the story of Hiram Abiff coming up in the next hour, and showing you how this spirit is symbolically murdered. Okay? Because that's what he ultimately represents, is the spirit of man. And truth and natural law. So just like Ma'at was the spirit of truth and justice in the Egyptian tradition, in the Masonic tradition, Hiram Abiff represents these concepts. He represents morality, truth, natural law, justice, balance. That's why he sits in the middle between the two pillars. Okay? He rides a goat because he is controlling the base instincts or base passions represented by the goat, a traditional symbol in different pagan cultures and other dark forms of occultism of lower consciousness and, you know, just the instinctual nature of man itself. As we saw when we saw the Baphomet symbol that's used by the Church of Satan. That's why they choose the goat as their main symbol. Yes, it's a fertility symbol, but it's also a symbol of the darker aspects or the hidden aspects of consciousness that are often wielded as weapons. Okay? So, Hiram Abiff represents truth, balance, harmony, natural law. He rides the goat because he is basically controlling and sitting above the base instincts. Okay? So he has achieved mastery. He is blindfolded. This means he is blind to the worldly aspects of self. He has achieved inner spiritual vision. All right? We saw this in the movie The Matrix. The main character, Neo, becomes blinded to the world. And then he is blindfolded, okay? And then he needs to develop his spiritual vision in order to be able to see the Matrix for what it is. This is, you know, where this is borrowed from, actually. Okay? So he is there depicted in the center of the image with the Masonic compasses and square behind him, and he is between two pillars, which is a common theme in Freemasonry, with Hiram Abiff himself acting as this middle mediator, okay, between these two pillars, a symbolic third pillar, if you will. And this idea of three pillars, or two ways that diverge to the left and right, and then one that is a synthesis between them, that is basically acting as a balance point, it comes up over and over again in different occult traditions. And we already saw it previously looking at the tradition of Kabbalah, the Kabbalistic tree of life with its three paths. Okay, the path of severity on the left, the path of mercy on the right, and the unifying or synthesis path, which is the path of mildness in the middle. Again, this theme is repeated here in this imagery that basically symbolically depicts some of the symbols of Freemasonry, the ideas of Freemasonry, I should say. The two pillars are the left and right aspects of the brain. They are the masculine and feminine principles within us all. Okay? They are our emotions, the sacred feminine aspect, and our actions, the sacred male aspect, masculine. Okay? And we need to bring those into alignment with each other, okay, based on our knowledge of natural law and our knowledge of how we create what we get. We need to become knowledgeable about the generative principle, which is what we talked about largely in the first hour. And the generative principle is care. And it's basically the knowledge of how natural law works and caring enough to bring our emotions and our actions into harmony with that natural law such that we create goodness and order in the world. Not through our ignorance of natural law creating chaos, which is basically the situation that we have now. Hiram Abiff, this allegorical master mason, basically represents the knowledge of natural law. He represents truth, goodness, and order because he is the synthesis or the marriage between the masculine and feminine aspects of consciousness, or the unifying aspect or bringer together of emotion and action. Okay? So he is depicted here clothed in white, representing purity and goodness, and he is blindfolded, meaning that his sight is not of this world. It is a spiritual or inner sight. And we left off in the last hour saying that this was picked up in the allegory The Matrix, a great movie trilogy allegory, okay, which is about spiritual awakening. And the hero, Neo, who ultimately represents the higher part of the brain, the neocortex, okay, who needs to understand himself as the one, meaning to bridge the left and right or the masculine and feminine sides of himself so that he can come into harmony with his true path, with what he knows he needs to do, becomes blinded later on in that series to the physical world or the matrix world, and he develops true spiritual vision. He can see the matrix for what it is, truly for what it really looks like. So that's what this is symbolically saying here. Hiram Abiff is the true spiritual vision. He is truth. He is higher consciousness. He is the spirit of things. The unifying aspect of everything is spirit. Okay? So he could be identified or kind of likened to, he is analogous to the Holy Spirit in the Christian tradition. Okay? Again, this was the sacred feminine divine mother in other traditions that predate Christianity, but again, the sacred feminine is downplayed because that's all about the emotional qualities, and modern religion is a male dominator a male dominator game. Okay, so the sacred feminine had to be removed and, as we saw, replaced by a dove, the symbol of the dove representing the Holy Spirit in the Christian tradition, the religious Christian tradition, I should say. Hiram Abiff, Okay, there is a legend, there is an allegory to him. And before I get into that allegory, I would like to read a brief description of the symbolic meaning of the ram. Okay, because that's what Hiram Abiff represents. It's a wordplay. Wordplay is often found in different occult teachings, and it is also found in Freemasonry. Hiram Abiff is high ram above. Okay, he is the ram that exists with the gods. He's not really here on the earth as a man. This is a symbol. Okay, it's an allegory. It's not a real person. He was biblically, he was one of the builders of the Temple of Solomon. Okay, because he is the middle or unifying aspect between the base consciousness, or the lower physical aspects of consciousness, which are represented by Hiram, king of Tyre, in the Masonic allegory of the building of Solomon's temple. Hiram Abiff is the sacred feminine midbrain, which is where our emotions derive from. Okay, the ability of us to feel the repercussions of our actions toward other people. And then Solomon is the left and right brain, or the neocortex, the telencephalon of the brain. Okay, he is the sun and the moon come together. Solomon. Okay, this is an allegory about the building of the brain and the building of the human heart in harmony with natural law and morality. Okay, we have to understand this from a more mature symbolic perspective, rather than thinking of these as literal things. Okay, so Hiram Abiff is identified with the beginning of Aries, the beginning of the zodiac, when the sun rises in resurrection at the spring equinox. That's when that happens in Aries. So he is the bringer of the light, okay, into a world of darkness, understanding of natural law and truth. All right? So let's look at some of the symbolic meanings of the ram traditionally. Okay, the animal symbolism of the ram is traditionally used to represent power, force, drive, energy, virility, vitality, protection, and fearlessness. All right, these are the qualities that the ram traditionally is used to represent in all forms of occultism, basically. Okay? A look into mythology will reveal the ram as associated with many gods over time. And I'll read you a short list of those gods, and you can understand that this is a basic retelling in Freemasonry of different hero myth traditions, in which Hiram Abiff represents all of these gods in the Masonic tradition. Okay? If a god amongst the people, okay, wouldn't you agree that these are admirable qualities? So, in other words, Hiram Abiff represents the godlike qualities that we can embody as human beings. And I hear the intro music, and we'll be right back, ladies and gentlemen. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're back on What on Earth is Happening. Before the break, I was discussing Hiram Abiff and how that is a wordplay for Hiram above, the zodiacal sign of Aries, as being the bringer, the returner of the light, or the sun, into the northern hemisphere to begin spring and the season of rejuvenation, and how that is a symbol of spiritual awakening. Okay, so I was reading an excerpt about the symbolic meanings of the ram, and we saw that it is a symbol of power, drive, virility, protection, fearlessness, courage, in other words, okay? So these are admirable qualities, and these are qualities to be cultivated, to become more in harmony with divinity and natural law. So there are some gods that had symbolic connections to the ram in the ancient world. Among them was the Celtic god Cernunnos, and he was often shown with a ram. Some depictions of him show him seated with a ram-headed snake by his side, and this was a symbolic gesture of renewal and power. In ancient Egypt, the god Amun-Ra took on the persona of Khnum, the creator god, who was always depicted with a ram's head. Okay? In Scandinavia, in the Norse tradition, Thor was often connected closely with a ram, and he was fabled to use rams to pull his chariot. Okay, Thor. Other gods that were connected in the ancient world with the strong will, okay, because this is about the will. Hiram Abiff is ultimately about higher will with a capital W, will to come into harmony with natural law and the ultimate drive behind creation, which is ultimately to live in harmony with the laws of nature and the laws of higher morality. That's what it's ultimately all about. Achieving self-mastery. Mastery over self. And only through which can we obtain any level of mastery of nature. It's not even mastery. It would just be really living in harmony with it so that we don't use it as a destructive power, which we're currently doing. Okay? So other gods connected to the strong will of the ram were Zeus, Apollo, and Apollo plays very prominently in Freemasonry. Agni from India, Indra, also an Indian god, Hermes, Roman, okay, and Grecian, Ea, a god of the Middle East, and Baal, another Middle Eastern or Phoenician god. It is noteworthy that the ram is the first sign of the zodiac, as Aries. Hence, it is the symbolic form of impetus, fervor, renewal, virility, and fiery force, all connected with the coming of the sun or of the light. Okay? This sign embraces the return of the warmth of the sun as the March equinox approaches. Okay, so symbolically, that is what we are seeing here when we're seeing the symbol of Hiram Abiff, and that is what the story of the building of Solomon's temple biblically is ultimately about, is building with light, becoming a builder with the light, with the spirit, which Hiram Abiff, as the main architect of the Temple of Solomon, okay, represents. This is a representative symbolic allegory, okay? So, let's continue to look at the legend of Hiram Abiff in the Masonic tradition. Okay, so I'll read a brief excerpt about this tradition, this legend, and then we'll analyze it. Hiram Abiff, a widow's son from Tyre. Now we'll get to what the widow's son symbolically means, okay? Skillful in the working of all kinds of metals. Right there, that is symbolic. Working in metals. So he's an alchemist. This is not physical. This is not literal metals, okay? He's supposed to be the builder of the Temple of Solomon and builds with metals. That was his forte. But this is an alchemical allegory. It's symbolic, okay? He was employed to help build King Solomon's temple. The legend tells us that one day, while worshiping the grand architect of the universe, which we saw that G in the middle of the compasses and squares symbolically represents, okay, so he is accosted by 3 ruffians, as the legend goes, and this is done at 3 areas of the Temple of Solomon while it is being built. The first is the east gate, the second, the south gate, and the third, the west gate, where Hiram is finally slain. And we'll look into this symbolically, okay? The east gate is where the sun rises. The south is the direction that the sun takes its trek through the sky during the day. It does not go into the northern part of the sky, but the southern part of the sky is where it makes its arc in the northern hemisphere, okay? And then it sets in the west, or the sun dies for the day, and then he resurrects to new life the next day to repeat the cycle all over again. So the 3 ruffians called Jubilah, Jubilo, and Jubilum at the Temple of Solomon, okay? They attacked him at the east gate of the temple, then the south gate, and then the west gate. So the first ruffian, Jubilah, attacks him at the east gate, then Jubilo at the south gate, and then Jubilum at the west gate. This is symbolic of the sun's path through the sky, and it's rising and setting each day, okay? So the east gate is where he rises, the eastern horizon. The sun comes up, the light, which Hiram Abiff represents. The south gate represents its zenith, because the sun at its zenith, from the perspective of those living in the northern hemisphere, always makes a trek through the southerly portion of the sky, not the north. Okay, this is also why there are 3 candles in Freemasonry's altar, one at the east, one at the south, one at the west, but not one in the north. Okay, so the west then is the death place of the sun, the setting place of the sun each day, and symbolically that's where Hiram is slain, and then he, resurrects the next day, like the sun resurrects to new life at the beginning of each day and repeats the cycle all over again. Okay, so these 3 ruffians, Jubilah, Jubilo, and Jubilum, attack Hiram. Okay, so they are demanding the lost word. Okay, the master word, the master mason's word, and it's supposed to be the secret name of God. Hiram Abiff refuses to divulge this deeply held secret of the builders, and therefore he is attacked by these 3 ruffians. The first ruffian, named Jubilah, strikes Hiram across the throat with a 24-inch gauge, which is another Masonic tool symbolically. Okay, and well, there's the outro music for this break, and we'll be right back after these messages, folks. The first ruffian named Jubilah struck Hiram across the throat with a 24-inch gauge. This represents stopping speaking the truth, or not speaking the truth at all. He hits him in the throat chakra. Okay, so I've often said that the universe is spoken into existence. Other people have said that other people have said that history will reward those with the loudest voice. You may have heard it said that way, but essentially, we need to put the truth out there in order for people to understand it, grasp it, and then live in harmony with it. So it needs to be spoken. So that's what that's symbolic of. The second ruffian, named Jubilo, struck Hiram's breast over the heart with a square. Okay, so this represents not feeling or caring. Okay, and he hits it with the square, which is what represents the lower base instincts, or the base passions, the lower consciousness. And this symbolically represents apathy, is a way to kill the light, okay, within us. The third ruffian, named Jubilum, struck Hiram upon the forehead with a gavel, okay, or a setting maul in some tellings of the story, okay, where Hiram fell dead. All right, so he is struck in the head, which is the place of thoughts. So this is about knowing the truth. This is ignorance, in other words. Okay, so the 3 ways that the light is put to death is through apathy, through ignorance, and then through laziness, not then putting it out into the world. Okay, or the courage to speak, not having the courage to speak, which is cowardice. All right, these are the murderers of the light. These are the murderers of righteousness and morality and goodness, basically. All right, so Hiram, having been killed, was carried out the east gate of the temple and buried outside Jerusalem. Early the following morning, King Solomon visited the temple, found the workmen in confusion because no plans had been made for the day's work, since Hiram was the chief architect. Okay, fearing the evil had befallen Hiram, King Solomon sent out 12 fellow craft masons to look for Hiram. Again, the number 12, right, symbolic of the 12 signs of the zodiac. Hiram Abiff representing the light, or the sun. Okay, he's the widow's son. All right, he is the Masonic Christ, in other words. Okay, it is just another retelling of the same story that we looked at when we in depth covered astrotheology and religion as astrotheology. Okay, so what I'm attempting to get people to explain, to understand by explaining this, is the same thing that I was when I was explaining astrotheology. Get past that to the deep underlying tradition about consciousness that it is attempting to teach. Okay, so fearing evil had befallen him, he sends out 12 fellow craft masons to look for Hiram. That's symbolic because the fellow craft is all about care. And you have to care enough to seek out the light or the truth in order to ever find it. Okay. King Solomon himself accompanied the 3 Masons who journeyed toward the east. So he sent out 3 in each direction. This is symbolic of the seasons, and he goes toward the east, which is symbolic of the rising sun. Okay, and it's also symbolic of going toward the east, which is the symbol of Aries, Hiram Abiff. Okay, and it's symbolic of the resurrection of the light or of truth. Okay, so having finally located the grave of Hiram Abiff, Solomon and his fellow Masons exhumed the body. A search was made for the Master's word, but all that was found was the letter G, which we talked about extensively in the first hour of the show. Okay, the generative principle or true care, meaning that that was still present to some degree. Finding the lost word, a lament went up, "O Lord my God, is there no help for the widow's son?" And we'll understand what this cry of distress means in a moment. Okay? They first took hold of Hiram's body with the Boaz grip of the 1st degree. This failed to achieve its purpose. This means emotion alone will not ultimately achieve the purpose that you are seeking. Okay? You need to combine it. Right? Then they repositioned their hold upon Hiram's body using the Joachim grip of the 2nd degree. This also failed to achieve its purpose. Now, this represents having developed the will to act alone. Okay, the Joachim pillar represents the male principle. Okay, that also fails to accomplish its purpose. Solomon finally raises Hiram from the dead using the 3rd degree grip of the Master Mason. Okay, now this represents putting all of them together, our thoughts, our emotions, and our actions in unity with each other. Okay, the place of higher knowledge. Ultimately, the grip that finally raises him is Solomon's grip, which represents symbolically true knowledge of oneself. This represents deeper, esoteric, spiritual knowledge. Okay, represented by the coming together of the left and right brain, or the awakening of the all-seeing eye. Okay, the coming together of the masculine and feminine forces within the self. All right, and this is also symbolically represented by the 5 points of fellowship, which is a Masonic greeting, which represents the coming together of earth, air, water, fire, and ether, or spirit. Okay, basically, the most important of which is the spiritual aspects. Okay, the 5 points of fellowship is what he raised him with as well, and by uttering in Hiram's ear the phrase Mahabon, which is often used in conjunction with the 5 points of fellowship, grip and stance, in order to identify oneself as a Mason, a Freemason. So, in thus doing so, Solomon had raised Hiram Abiff from the dead. This represents the symbolic raising of the light and of truth from the dead. The spirit is what is being raised. Okay, and we'll look at this extensively through the symbols of Freemasonry over the coming weeks. So, what I want to essentially look at here was that Hiram is killed by the failure to use our thoughts. Okay, intelligence. He is also killed by the failure to care, which is apathy, and he is also killed by the failure to speak and act, which is cowardice. Okay, not having the courage to actually speak and act, and then the failure to do so is the lack of will.